Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining us for the CTTST Grand Rounds today. Dr. Rick Inbach and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our speaker, our good friend and colleague, Dr. Emily Anderson. Dr. Anderson is an associate professor in the Neiswanger Institute for Bioethics in the Stritch School of Medicine at Loyola University of Chicago. Rick and I have known Dr. Anderson for many years, but from different angles. Rick has worked closely with Dr. Anderson in her role as associate editor for 3 journals, Jerry, the Journal of Empirical Research on Human Research Ethics, Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics, and AJOB Empirical Bioethics. I have known Dr. Anderson for a long time because we studied under the same doctoral mentor at St. Louis University, where she studied research ethics and responsible conduct of research. Currently, her areas of interest and expertise include research with vulnerable populations, informed consent, and all things IRB policy, and the application of qualitative research techniques to the study of research ethics. She's been a co-investigator on numerous federally funded research and education projects. She's published in over 50 peer-reviewed journals and released her first book in 2018 titled 100 Questions and Answers about Research Ethics. Dr. Anderson joins us today to discuss how compliance is the minimum standard required for ethical research. Principal investigators and research teams must be prepared to respond in the field when ethical dilemmas arise. The title of her presentation is Beyond Compliance, Transforming Research Culture. Dr. Anderson, we welcome you today and invite you to share your slides as you have already done. I would like to remind you all to utilize the chat function of Zoom to ask your questions during and after Dr. Anderson's presentation. All questions and comments will be addressed at the end of her talk, and Dr. Inbach will be moderating the Q&A for us today. So thank you, Dr. Anderson, for joining us. You can take it away.
Thanks so much, Holly, and thanks for inviting me here to talk about or give me an opportunity to synthesize a lot of things that I've been thinking about lately, especially during the pandemic, which has drawn attention to scientific integrity and the research enterprise. So the title of this talk is Beyond Compliance. And as Holly said in her introduction, I'm a bioethicist who studies the ethics of research, but I'm also someone who does research myself. I manage several empirical research projects. So this talk is about ethics, but at its core, it's really about researchers and how we make decisions. Decisions about how to balance competing interests, about what and who to prioritize, about when to delegate, when to do something ourselves, about when to ask rather than figure out something on our own. And as researchers, every day we make dozens or even hundreds of decisions that affect the accuracy of our data, that affect the health and safety of our research subjects, human and animal, that affect the quality of peer review and the nature of our collaborations, among other things. And when we make bad decisions, there might be consequences for us, for our subjects, for our staff, for our mentees, for our colleagues, for science and the scientific record, and for broader society, whether we're talking about harm to future patients or erosion of public trust. So my goal today is to synthesize research from several areas that are related to research integrity, research misconduct, and decision-making, and review recommendations from different experts and scholars of research integrity. And I tried to package this in a way that's interesting for the research community broadly, and not just people like me who study research integrity. And that ultimately supports my argument that I think we're at a critical turning point, and that essentially it's really time to think about transforming the culture of research to motivate and support scientists and research teams to prioritize research integrity over productivity. And this transformation is necessary to support ethical science and create a scientific culture that ultimately is not just better for research integrity and research participants and the public, but also better for scientists. Many scientists think of compliance as a set of hoops that they have to jump through, and think of ethics as something really esoteric, right? That's far removed from the day-to-day practice of science and ultimately limiting. Philosophical discussions about the dangers of doing certain things, playing God, or talking about theoretical long-term risks. But to put it in more basic terms, to me, ethics and compliance should be thought of as tools, tools that help us make research-related decisions. And ultimately, I think of ethics not as something esoteric and far in the future, but about being about what we do in the moment. And I think what scientists do in the moment is as influenced by the culture as it is by their training. And that's really kind of at the heart of what I'm going to be talking about today. That culture has more of an influence than training, knowledge of rules, or frameworks for ethical analysis. And so, the answers and solutions to all of these decisions that we have to make as researchers are not always straightforward. And this is where the tools of ethics and compliance come in handy. In a professional research setting, ethics is about balancing competing goods, like what harms are worth risking in order to potentially benefit human health and flourishing. And this asks, we ask questions like, how do we get the most out of the data we collect from research participants while also protecting their privacy? These are the kinds of balances that we have to make. But compliance is about how ethics gets operationalized, or more specifically, how these decisions with ethical implications get operationalized. They help us, compliance creates a framework for these decisions. And they all provide guidance that help make expectations less vague and hopefully reduce the influence of bias and minimize researcher motives to take shortcuts. So from my perspective, ethics and compliance are both really important tools that should be considered just part of being a good researcher. They're as important as analytic techniques, learning how to write up results, learning how to present. They're just part of being a good scientist. So compliance is important because the rules represent a shared set of norms for scientists, but there's a difference between research compliance and what we call research integrity or responsible research. And it's important to distinguish between the two, right? Thinking of compliance as necessary, but not sufficient. First, as I've alluded to earlier, there's certain issues about which there are no written rules or only informal guidance, right? So for example, there's no formal guidance regarding how to solve conflicts that arise in mentoring relationships or in collaborations. Although NIH is starting to ask for conflict management plans for certain kinds of proposals like program project grants, there's no rules about, what do you do when there's a dispute between, co-PIs or things like that. Second, there's a lot of gray areas in the regulations, right? We're all aware of this. Investigators and IRBs have a lot of discretion about things like waiving and altering consent, inclusion and exclusion criteria for who's in their studies, safety monitoring plans, and payment to research participants. Compliance is necessary but not sufficient because science is changing. One of the examples I always use when I talk to students, because a lot of them don't remember this, is that 30 years ago, there was barely an internet. So our research regulations don't talk about what to do when you're gathering data on the internet. And in the last 10 years, there's been really significant advances in genetics as well as AI and machine learning. So science is always changing and the rules don't keep up with the science. And norms are changing, maybe even faster than we realize. So scientists think differently than we did 10 or 15 years ago about our responsibilities for engaging communities and patients. We think differently about using biological samples and when we need consent. We think differently about returning results and sharing results with participants and when we need to do that. We think differently about disseminating results, and we think differently about sharing raw data with the scientific community. Norms around those things, I think, have really changed maybe faster than we realize. And lastly, compliance isn't enough because things don't always go as planned in the field, right? I always tell students, like, science is a social endeavor. The practice of science is complicated because it involves people. It involves technical failures, unanticipated risks, and of course, human error. And in the world of human research, people are unpredictable and participants don't always necessarily react the way you thought you would. And questions come up in the field and things happen in the field that you have to be prepared to respond to. And so for all of those reasons, responsible science or research integrity, research conducted with integrity, involves more than compliance. But compliance is still very important and obviously foundational to ethical science. And because the implications of non-compliance and other forms of scientific misconduct are significant in terms of public trust and continued funding from the public sector, and from the private sector for research, and the continued participation of citizens, which we have to remember, if they don't trust us, they're not going to participate in our studies. There's a really significant effort that's being made to conduct research to understand unethical behavior and understand noncompliance in scientific work and what might be done to prevent or manage noncompliance and misconduct, or at least identify and stop it sooner. So to summarize this growing body of work on contributors to noncompliance and research misconduct, I think it's useful to think about some myths and realities about science. I think the first myth that drives a lot of thinking about compliance and ethics and researcher behavior is that misconduct is a problem for only a few bad apples. And the reality is this is that when you look at noncompliance and you look at behaviors that fall into the category of misconduct, not following your protocol, not getting consent from subjects, not following animal regulations, the reality is that noncompliance is rarely intentional, and thus all researchers are susceptible. It's not just a problem of bad people doing bad things. It's something that we could all do. And I think that's really scary to think about. And it's easier to sort of put our heads in the sand and think I'm a good person, I'd never do anything bad, but that can get people into a lot of trouble. The prevailing norm in science, and I think this is a myth, is that more is always better. And I'm real big on examining what I will later refer to as the tyranny of productivity. But this idea that like more grants, more papers, more projects are always better, right? You can't be too busy. When in fact, the busiest scientists are those that are most likely to make mistakes unless they take time to take special care. And again, that's one of those realities that we just have to face, but it's easier to sort of ignore that reality. And myth number 3, I would say, is this idea that scientific skills are enough to keep out of trouble. There's this saying, good ethics starts with good science. And so it's tempting to sort of flip that and say, if you do good science, you'll automatically do good ethics, but that's not the case. And in fact, deprioritizing resources for compliance and oversight and neglecting to carve out time to think about and learn about and discuss ethical issues relevant to your field, I think is a big driver of unintentional research misconduct. And simple strategies like establishing authorship policies or setting regular meetings with your staff can play a major role in ensuring compliance with particularly human subjects and animal regulations, I would say. They can also prevent future conflicts related to things like authorship or potential problems with data integrity that could lead to a series of tough decisions and potential temptations. Because that's how I frame research misconduct, is people get stuck in tough positions and then they make bad decisions out of panic or lack of attention to the importance of the decision that they have to make. But these activities, these slow activities, right? Taking time to meet, walking the room, doing your due diligence, those things aren't necessarily rewarded. And like a lot of other people in other areas of life, this is sort of my little joke about the pandemic, researchers don't always prioritize prevention. We know, those of us that work in public health know that prevention doesn't get prioritized. And I would say it's similar when we think about preventing misconduct. And I think that these myths are largely responsible for the deprioritization of ethics and compliance by many scientists. In reality, I think there's also these other factors that lead researchers to make bad decisions, which is ultimately how I frame noncompliance as a bad decision or a bad set of decisions. The first is new and unfamiliar territory. When entering uncharted waters without taking time to stop and learn about rules or emerging ethical discussions, scientists might fail to consider the consequences of certain actions or the full range of options that are available to them. The second is complex situations that are likely to involve difficult to interpret or even conflicting rules and principles, in which cases we're sometimes tempted to default to those, to our self-serving biases and do the thing that's best for us. And a third and really important factor, which I'll talk about later, which relates to this sort of tyranny of productivity, is emotions and stress, which are shown to influence reasoning processes. And I think we all have experienced times when we make bad decisions because we're tired or overworked or hungry. We all joke about hanger, but it's a it's a real phenomenon and can lead to bad decisions. And these decisions might include like acting in haste without thinking through all the consequences, failing in terms of our due diligence, like not triple checking the accuracy of data or our experiments or our data collection instruments, deciding not to report innocent mistakes or things that were problems due to neglect and just doing a quick fix, or even maybe acting in a vengeful way, or at worst cases, lying. And so emotional overload and stress, I think, is a big part of the issue here. But what's important to recognize about all these factors is that they're not just about the individual, but they're influenced by the particular situations, but most importantly, the environment. And so I want to be very clear that when I talk about non-compliance and the deprioritization or lack of attention to ethical issues, I'm definitely not framing these as character flaws or as moral failings of individual scientists. You know, this talk is about transforming culture, and I see these as cultural and not individual problems. They manifest at the level of researcher decisions, but they're really things that are influenced by the culture. And I think this will sound familiar to, you know, anybody who's working in science right now. A report that was issued by the National Science Board in 2014 on reducing investigators' administrative workload cited a study which found that principal investigators on federal research grants spend over 40% of their time on administrative tasks. And that's not all compliance, because it includes a lot of things like hiring and, you know, fixing the references on your papers maybe. But a large fraction of that 40% is compliance related task. And I think without even hearing this kind of depressing statistic, we would all agree that the burden of compliance has grown exponentially over the past couple of decades, while at the same time, the demands of a scientific career have also grown in other ways, right? Teams are bigger and more interdisciplinary. Like the number of people that I interact with in a day on my very few research projects is crazy. And people running large program project grants, you know, could be interacting with 75 people in a day, which is a big cognitive overload. Equipment's become more expensive. Analysis techniques are more sophisticated, right? We're working with bigger and more amounts of data. And researchers are being expected to cover more of their salaries with grants. And researchers are required to know rules and regulations for a variety of different things, especially as we focus on interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary translational science. It means that people need to know biosafety and animal research and human research and financial conflicts of interest and authorship policies and data sharing. And, you know, they have to remember to register their clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov. And you have to remember to make sure that if your paper is funded with public money, you have to put it in PubMed, and all of those things that you have to do, all of those tasks are very, very burdensome. And I think it's just, you know, common sense that the more rules we have to follow, it becomes more difficult to follow them all. And I think this overload can lead to disengagement from compliance responsibilities and ultimately disengagement from just thinking about ethical issues more broadly and integrating thinking about these issues in the day-to-day work of science. Regulations can seem like a punishment for all due to the mistakes of a few and not necessarily worthy of close attention. And understandably, researchers are getting increasingly frustrated because it often seems like a lot of these institutional policies have a primary intention of protecting the institution rather than protecting the integrity of the science or of the animal or human subjects that they are supposed to prevent. So in such an environment, we can see how researchers' robust ethical obligations, right, things like protecting human subjects, kind of become reduced to what Holly and my mentor, Jim Dubois, who I draw on a lot of his work and work that we've collaborated on with each other, what he calls ritual performance aimed at satisfying a regulatory requirement. And I can think of two examples that I hear all the time in language that investigators that I work with use that sort of exemplify this like ritual performance status aimed at satisfying a regulatory requirement. So the first is I hear people saying some version of like, I have to do my IRB. Um, and this shows how, this thing called the research protocol, which is in fact like a dynamic master plan and roadmap that's meant to guide a very complex activity done by a research team that has a lot of moving parts that might change over time, is ultimately reduced to this like thing that has to go down on paper only for the purposes of IRB review. And it kind of becomes a ritual done for the sake of compliance, when in fact, that protocol is really, really important to the research you do, right? It's like the foundation for any publications that you're going to make. It tells everybody it gets everybody on your team on the same page. But it's sort of become this thing that researchers think of as being like for the IRB. And so they do it for the IRB as opposed to thinking about the broader meaning of it. The second is another peculiar thing that I've noticed in human subjects research, and that's the word consenting. As in, I consented the subject, or we will consent the subject. And yes, in part, this frustrates me because I was an English major and I am like, language is really important to me. But the way that the process of informed consent was initially conceived of, a potential participant gives their voluntary informed consent to participate in a study after they have a conversation about the risks and benefits of a study and the burdens. But somewhere along the way, this idea of consent as something that the participant gives turned into a verb, like something that we do as researchers to participants. And it becomes like a ritual that's performed by getting a signature on a piece of paper. And those are just like two examples that I come up quickly because they're things that I'm always trying to work against in some of the work I do doing research ethics consultation. But they're examples of how important compliance activities get reduced to performance amidst this backdrop of increasing burdens. So, given these increasing burdens, it makes sense that neither compliance, which is associated with burdensome administrative tasks that are related to rules, and by association ethics, which is characterized by systematic, thoughtful deliberation when rules aren't enough, it makes sense that these things have become somewhat, I would argue, deprioritized or under-prioritized in our current research culture. And what do I mean by research culture? Because I'm going to talk about transforming the research culture. Culture describes the values, norms, beliefs, practices, and artifacts of a group. And as I said before, science is a social activity that takes place in the world. It takes place internationally, but also within different settings, right? Within an academic or other research institution, with funding from other institutions, in collaboration with other people. So there's a culture of science broadly. And then individual research institutions also have their unique cultures, as do labs and different disciplines. So every scientist, in a sense, operates in multiple cultures, as well as within this larger shared culture of science. And as I see it, and a lot of people have also made the same observation, that there is a problem with our research culture right now. And this problem extends across research institutions, although certainly some cultures are worse than others. And some institutional cultures or individual labs or teams might even be toxic. While others might have features that are protective against misconduct, like despite this overall scientific culture that deprioritizes ethics and compliance. And on this slide, I have a number of sort of questions just to get us thinking about how institutional research cultures might be characterized. And these are things like how research is incentivized and what gets prioritized, what's ignored, what support exists, what resources exist, is access to resource equitable, who gets that access and who doesn't get that access. And I think really importantly, when it comes to issues of research integrity and compliance, do researchers and members of their teams feel safe admitting mistakes or admitting that they don't know the answer to something or asking for help when they need it? And are there places where they can go to have these discussions or get the answers to these questions? And do they feel safe going there? Every institution is different, but I think that many share some of these common negative cultural aspects due to a broader research culture that emphasizes productivity over quality, productivity over relationships, and then ultimately productivity over compliance and ethics. And so this culture, I would argue, leads to what I might call the outsourcing of compliance and the outsourcing of ethical decision making. And I think as science becomes more complex and administrative burdens increase, the more scientists not only feel okay about outsourcing compliance and ethics related responsibilities to other people, the more they feel that they have to do this in order for their careers to survive. They just don't have time to focus on doing that IRB, or thinking about how to do consent beyond that, getting the signature. And ultimately, when compliance and ethics get outsourced, this inhibits more integrated thinking about ethics with the science. And I think the biggest example, again, from the human subjects world that I see is an attitude that some investigators have, that they're just going to submit what they have to the IRB, and then the IRB will tell them if they have to change anything. Get it all down on paper, and the IRB will tell you if anything you're not doing is, if anything you propose is not right, and they'll tell you what to do. And again, I want to be really clear that this is, I don't see this as a moral failing of individual investigators. I see this as a monster that's been created by a system that just has too many rules and too many pieces of paper and too many compliance tasks. I think this is all, again, part of the culture, a monster that's been created by this culture. So then how do we change this culture? This gets to the more solution-oriented discussion of, or the solution-oriented part of my talk, and it synthesized the synthesis of the research on solutions. So I think for me, given the analysis of the problems that I presented, or my analysis of the problems based on some of the research literature, my proposal for transforming research culture requires focusing on 3 specific domains. This first domain is a domain that at my institution I'm responsible for, researcher education, and not just education, but also socialization and professional development for scientists. And I use this word education very deliberately, rather than training. And to be clear, it's more than educating people about the rules. It really is this issue of socialization, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. The second thing that needs to change is the environment at individual institutions. I think there's some things there that can be done, some things that work, that are worth implementing. But ultimately, there are fundamental aspects of the reward structure of science that need to change. And this is a really big swing, and this is a very idealistic, I think, set of suggestions to make. But in order to change the culture of science, the system of rewards really needs to change. So I'm going to talk a little bit about transforming education, and how I think transforming how education of scientists should be transformed. And as a faculty member on my campus with primary responsibility for responsible conduct of research education, it's always a little bit dangerous for me to criticize RCR education, because I can fall prey to doing some of these things, like standing up there and saying, these are the rules, blah, 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 ABC, follow them. Now you know them, and you can't blame me for saying that you did anything wrong. It's a lot easier for me to present these criticisms when I'm at a different institution. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the effectiveness of most RCR education is pretty limited, or that there's not really a correlation between how people are educated and whether or not they engage in non-compliance or misconduct. But I think a lot of the research focuses on educational strategies, right? Like, should things be didactic, or should there be use of case studies, or how do we engage people in this? But I think that the problem lies more in the framing, and how we sort of tee up the education and the purpose of that education, and how we talk about it in the broader culture of research. And I would say that a lot of RCR training is framed maybe implicitly as like a necessary evil, the purpose of which is to keep researchers out of trouble and to help institutions cover themselves, right? If institutions show that you were trained, then they have cover when you do something wrong. And I think this framing shapes the wrong attitudes, because it leads to kind of reinforcing some of those myths that I talked about before, right? That like knowing the rules is enough, that ethics is sort of arbitrary, that somebody else decides and then you have to follow the rules and someone will tell you if you're breaking them. And it also presents research integrity and rules and policies related to research integrity as something that's sort of made up for scientists by other people. And I think that these attitudes really distance science from rules. Again, Jim Dubois, who's done a lot of research on misconduct, has argued that compliance should be framed as a virtue of any good researcher. And when compliance is framed as a virtue, rather than something merely instrumental, it sends a message that it's not just knowing and following the rules, but understanding where the rules came from and why they are important. And I think this kind of framing helps not just with buy-in, but it helps researchers know what to do when they're in the gray areas, right? So if you understand the principles, you understand what to do when the rules don't exactly tell you what to do. But I also think that framing compliance as a virtue helps researchers or promotes thinking about ethics as a practice that's important to learn, as important as any data analysis technique. But most importantly, I think framing compliance as a virtue motivates researchers to participate in local ethics oversight activities, like sit on IRBs, sit on IACUCs, sit on biosafety committees, serve on panels that investigate research misconduct, work with their institutions to come up with things like, blanket authorship policies, et cetera. And I think it can also motivate scientists to engage in conversations about ethical issues and policy making efforts in their own disciplines and fields, which I think is really integral to transforming research culture and integrating these compliance issues and tasks with the everyday practice of science. And I think at the core, framing compliance as a virtue encourages researchers to own these things, as opposed to think of them as things that are imposed upon them by other forces that they're not really engaged with. And I think that framing is really central to addressing and reprioritizing compliance and ethics. I think framing responsible conduct of research as a lifelong learning endeavor also, rather than training that expires after a number of years and then has to be retaken, could also promote this prioritization of compliance and ethical sensitivity. And ultimately here, I really am talking about reframing from this us versus them mentality to promote the idea that regulation and oversight is there to actually benefit research, as opposed to slow them down and put up barriers. And I think, again, this is something that I start with on day one when I talk to students about ethics and regulations and compliance is, you have to think of this stuff as being part and parcel of your everyday practice, and you have to get involved with making the rules and talking about the rules, especially when you're moving into uncharted territories, because otherwise those rules will get made for you by other people. I also too think that that responsible conduct of research education should expand beyond some of the core instructional areas. So this sort of seems counterintuitive, because I'm saying there's already all of these rules that we need to learn. But I think the instructional areas that we focus on, like dividing up these things like humans, animals, they're very much based on this compliance framework and training mindset. And I think there's a couple other things that need to be integrated into responsible conduct of research education, like leadership and maintaining positive relationships, stress management and emotional control. I mentioned this a little bit, talking about contributors to research misconduct and non-compliance. I don't have time to get into all the really cool science around this, but there's some evidence that meditation and other emotion control techniques reduce recidivism in people with criminal histories of criminal behavior. You know, it's all about slowing down and not acting impulsively, getting input on decisions. And I'm convinced that teaching stress management techniques could prevent a lot of research misconduct, or that's at least like a hypothesis worth testing. That knowing, again, this idea that it's not enough to know the rules, it's about how you put them into practice when you're in stressful situations. And lastly, I think it's really important to incorporate some sort of assessment of personality and personal biases in research integrity education. And I'm not talking about like screening people out or picking people on the big 5 personality traits, but rather reflecting. And in my course, I often ask students to reflect on how they feel about confrontation, how they feel about sharing credit and getting credit, and experiences they've had in the past about being left out or not given credit for things that they've done, how they feel about authority, how they are about managing conflict, and how these kinds of things might influence how they would act in certain types of situations, and how they have to maybe be cognizant against working against those things. You know, working against being a person who doesn't like confrontation or doesn't want to talk about difficult things. That could be something that leads to a decision to not bring up a potential problem that you see in your research, which could lead to you know, research integrity issues down the line. So those types of things I think are important to integrate into researcher education. So transforming institutional structures. Getting to my last couple of slides here. Many of you with good reason might want to roll your eyes when I talk about transforming institutional culture, right? Universities are really slow boats and they don't turn very quickly. I think that's an analogy I borrowed from President Obama, who said the same thing about governments. But as others have pointed out, you know, when researchers need to learn new scientific methods or have questions about technical matters, they frequently turn to colleagues or the literature to find answers. So why don't they do the same, you know, about ethics of compliance? And when I was talking to Rick and Holly about my ideas for this talk, we discussed the idea and I think this was Rick's phrase and I wrote it down, and so I want to give him credit for it. This idea of the need for pause and discussion as just being like a good kind of thing to automate in our work when it comes to these issues. And there's a good deal of evidence in a lot of different contexts that like taking time out to, so to speak, when faced with a complex or high stakes decision, and then getting input from others will always lead to a better decision. And that's the kind of thing that needs to be sort of automated, but I do think it's a cultural issue and not necessarily a personal issue. You know, there's a lot of discussion in the moment about things like burnout and that, and I think there's a tendency to provide these like individual psychological solutions to what are really institutional or cultural problems. So again, I want to emphasize that this is really something that I think is important to not just think of as a personal practice, but something that needs to be like implemented on an institutional or cultural basis. I think one of the challenges is that when we have so many decisions to make, like our automatic response is like make it and move on, right? Like you get that email, there's a big question in there, you don't want it to sit in your inbox, you make a decision and move on. Instead of pausing and thinking about, you know, have you thought through all the potential consequences? Have you thought about who's affected by this decision and what could possibly happen? And I think there's a couple things that are happening right now in institutions, especially large academic medical centers that do a lot of interdisciplinary research. There's a lot of things that are happening now to operationalize some of this, in getting this culture of discussing things early and often, taking pause, in the form of one, research ethics consultation services, which many CTSA funded institutions have. I don't know if you guys have one, but they're just like what they sound, right? Experts that are available to anyone doing research that can help navigate ethical issues of any kind related to planning, conducting research, things that happen in the field, interpreting, disseminating results, or really anything that has potential implications for participant safety, welfare, equity, research integrity. That's one way that this sort of culture of pause and discussion can be operationalized. Another is this growing trend I'm seeing towards having embedded ethics or ethicists embedded in your research, which is being common. As I've even seen this in recently in NIH calls, NIH RFAs around AI and machine learning, as well as in things like genetics and biobanking, but having ethicists sort of accompany you along the way. You might not know exactly what your ethical issues are now, but we know that machine learning raises a lot of concerns about privacy, about equity, about off-target downstream effects that we need to keep our eyes on, and that just integrating that opportunity for pause and discussion into your day-to-day work is one way of making sure that the ethics doesn't fall far behind the science, right? And I think these are especially good models when you're moving into uncharted territory. But I think the lessons learned from some of these, experiments with embedded ethics is that they could be useful to people doing, who are doing, things that they've been doing all along, and maybe just not taking the time to think about ethical implications. And so I see these as institutional issues because they do require some change to the local culture and providing resources locally for researchers, because I think that's really important here, to have these resources locally. So my last big bucket for transformation is really about what we value. And I think that in order to create a culture in which compliance and ethics is reprioritized or highly prioritized, there has to be some fundamental changes to the way that we assess and reward what researchers do. And so I wanted to end by just sharing some ideas from a document called the Hong Kong Principles for Assessing Researchers, which was published a couple of years ago. And I'm not sure that this has gotten much publicity or traction outside the small world of people who study and teach research integrity. And so I want to, I want to be part of trying to share this with the broader research community, because it's going to take, I think, some advocacy across a lot of areas of science to sort of put these things into action. But the Hong Kong Principles came out of the 6th World Conference on Research Integrity, with the goal of encouraging greater recognition for researchers to commit robust, rigorous, and transparent practices. And essentially, they're arguing that more emphasis should be placed on rigor in hiring, reviewing, and promotion decisions. And, I think anybody who, teaches in a medical school, for example, there's this adage that's like, if you don't assess it, nobody's going to pay attention to learning it. Like, you have to assess in order for people to value something, right? And in a lot of ways, we don't include a lot of things related to ethics, compliance, and research integrity in the way that we assess and reward researchers. A big one is all of the things that we do, which I haven't talked to contribute to the peer review process, right? That's something that nobody gets really rewarded for, but if we don't do it, the whole system will fall apart. And if we do it poorly, we end up with a lot of, questionable research that ends up in the research record. In the preamble to the principles, the authors, who are an international group of experts in research integrity, argue that our current metrics are perverse. That's their words. I would use tyranny of productivity. They use perverse incentives. And instead, they propose a set of what they call responsible metrics that are in line with these 5 principles. The first is that that responsible research practices should simply be assessed. So right now we have these dominant metrics, right? Publications, citations, grant dollars. And in some countries, people can even get bonuses for publishing in certain journals. And none of these speak to the rigor of the work or the responsibility of a researcher's contribution to research and society. And, it's very clear, especially as we start to get new requirements like data sharing, for example. Being a responsible researcher takes more time and resources, and this can create a disadvantage for researchers who participate in those activities. And first and foremost, the authors of the Hong Kong Principles argue that there's a need to acknowledge this in assessment. And so the rest of the principles sort of fall in line with this dominant idea. We should value complete reporting, such as the registration of trials, the registration of hypotheses, the registration of experiments done before the fact, so that we don't get a lot of post hoc analyses, and publishing all findings. Right, that's controversial because that's going to take getting journals on board as well. But that's kind of part of their broad picture of responsible science, and thinking that all of this needs to be taken into account. The third is rewarding the practice of open science and open research, which brings equality to the research process. That, again, is something that takes a little bit of effort, right? Putting your data into those repositories, things like that. The fourth is acknowledging a broader range of research activities, particularly around dissemination, and sort of expanding the idea that there's one right kind of research or only a few right kind of research. And I would say that nobody understands this struggle more than people who do community engaged research. I don't know if there's any of you in the audience. I have done community engaged research myself and work with community engaged researchers. There's a lot that goes into that just doesn't get acknowledged in the current metrics that we have. Institutions are trying to change around that particular issue, but it's related to some of these other things as well. Kind of moving beyond the short-term research cycle that we have right now. And I think this also relates to things like funding and rewarding replication of not just your own findings, but of others' findings. And then the final principle gets to what I was talking about earlier, recognizing other essential tasks like peer review and mentoring. These tasks done well are really critical to the optimal functioning and integrity of science, and they need to be incorporated into the scientific review structure. They can't be things that we do in our free time, or that we fit in between our Zoom meetings. And so I very much agree with these principles and this radical idea that we need to restructure the way that scientists are assessed and rewarded. But I also think that they do need to be supplemented, or could be supplemented, by small changes in institutional culture and the way that we educate researchers when it comes to compliance and ethics. And it's going to take changes across all of these levels, I think, in order to promote commitment to compliance and engagement with these issues. So that's sort of my broad argument and the end of my formal presentation. And I'm glad that I have a few minutes for questions and discussion. And I think Rick is going to help me with that.
So thank you, Emily. Great talk. Thanks for being willing to take on the culture that we're a part of, the culture that does a lot of great things, but has some barriers. And thanks for your willingness to identify some of the barriers, make them more transparent for us. So we want to invite our attendees today to submit some questions through the chat box. And so while people are mulling those over, and I want to ask you one question, and it draws from a comment from Mike Link. Mike is the chair of our IRB over on the UC side. Right? And so Mike had mentioned that he had overheard a person, investigator not long ago, talk about how they were able to consent a person in a minute, get it done, get it over with, get on with the research kind of thing. And my concern is that something like this is often viewed by the research team and staff as a very positive quality and characteristic. But beneath it is that whole emphasis on efficiency and speed that somehow gets mischaracterized as an ethical tenet. Have you ever, or could you comment on that that somehow in our fast-paced world, that efficiency and speed have kind of almost been characterized as an ethical tenet, and a positive that somehow stands in contrast to some of the other values and priorities that we have in front of us?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I think the sort of the emphasis on efficiency kind of goes along with this productivity, right? In order to be productive, you have to be really efficient. And, there's so much emphasis on, I think this is an example, right now I'm thinking of another example where this cycle, kind of self-perpetuating cycle, right? There's so much emphasis now on how many clinical trials don't enroll a sufficient number of subjects, right? And so, right, so you hear, we can consent people really quickly. That's a good solution to the problem. Well, that's not the problem. Isn't that people can't get consented fast enough, right? The problem is that for whatever reason, people are not interested in participating in research. So to me, when I think about efficiency as being a good thing, I think that's not the core of the problem. That we haven't, the problem in clinical research is not that we can't get people consented fast enough. It's that we can't find people willing to hear about research, right? Or we can't find people who meet our complicated inclusion-exclusion criteria who are also willing to consider being in research because it's not something that has ever been presented to them before, or they don't trust the environment in, or that groundwork hasn't been laid. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but my reaction is like, that's really part of the problem. I think I personally have been, I don't know if I want to say guilty. The way I approach this issue when I'm talking about consent, for example, is that, when you, as a researcher or research staff member, if you consent people, right? If you take that attitude of consenting people and you do it too quickly and performatively, you're going to end up losing participants. And when I've talked to people who participated in research or agreed to participate in research before, they very much say, if somebody was rude to me or throwing too much information at me, or I just wanted to get out of the situation, I signed the consent form and then I ghosted them. And so to me, that idea of trying to build efficiency into the research recruitment process is like exactly the wrong thing to do, because you're going to end up losing people on the back end. But again, it's all part of the, like when you take that sort of efficiency productivity model and try to lay it on top of science, it doesn't work well.
That's right. And I'm not even sure it's just a function of our culture here as much as it is maybe a function of our broader culture or humanity or something, like do more with less and get farther, something like that. So this question idea comes from Catherine Bowers, who, as you know, coordinates some of our grand rounds. Catherine had mentioned something about journals, some journals actually requesting kind of the articles beforehand, before the results are in, with the tentative or possible commitment of publishing them irrespective of the results. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's an example of, I think, Catherine, I do think it's becoming implemented in like psychology, experimental psychology, I think is where this kind of first started. But I think it's a great example of how structures can change to reward, process and methods and, independent of good results or, whatever, positive results, whatever that means to you, or good results or interesting results. It promotes this idea that it's the testing the hypothesis is what matters, right? Not the findings. And I think that sort of strategy is part of this whole wave of thinking about different ways to reward rigorous and responsible research, right? So if if there's an agreement that we are going to publish your results based on the quality of your design and not the interestingness of your results, which is sort of a misnomer, right? Because results should be interesting. Like a hypothesis should be set up to be tested so that the results are of interest, no matter what you find, so that people are rewarded for that and not then incentivized to make their results look more interesting or more significant or more polished or whatever that means. I think that's an example of something that can that it's it might be a radical change on one hand, but I think from the process standpoint, it really isn't much of a radical change, right? Because we have all that written up beforehand, and I would certainly like to see that. I mean, one thing I didn't touch on is, which I have a hard time wrapping my head around, really, is the power of journals, the power that journals have over the way that we do science, and sort of the need to change that as well. And that's something that's external from the institutions that we work on. And I don't have a good answer for how we change that, except for we create new models and we migrate our research to those models, and then the old beasts have to catch up to these new models.
That's right. And I think some of it has to do with just adherence to good scientific principles and not adhering to whatever the competing models of the time. And I mean, potentially, as more people are being encouraged and supported for their approach to science, we sometimes stray from the core scientific method and model that at least we previously had been required to adhere to. We have another question, and it pertains to the complexity of science. And you mentioned the potential for disengagement. And we see this all the time. The investigators are required to, and the PIs are expected to endorse, and research staff are expected to kind of take responsibility for their area. But as science has gotten more complicated, more diverse, in some cases more fragmented and more complex, more costly, we're quick to disengage, or we're quick to defer to others. And I think that distancing has presented some problems. Could you talk a little bit more about the role of complexity of science in that disengagement?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing that comes to mind, and I don't know if this is where you were headed with the question, but there's so much conversation now about like passion and purpose, and I think this is kind of related to a little bit of what I was talking about with reflection. I think it's really easy now to, as science becomes more complex, right? We're encouraged to sort of follow the money.
Yeah.
And I think that leads to fragmentation of our own work.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, I mean, in some ways this sounds like a little like new agey hippy dippy, right? But if you have a central guiding principle or purpose for the projects that you select, I think that can also help prevent that disengagement, right? Some of it is just not having so many different things steal your attention, and being able to focus kind of more into the future and integrate your work into a long-term project. But that's really hard for a lot of people to do, especially when you're first starting out. You kind of have to take opportunities as they come, right? Somebody invites you to join their team. A grant announcement comes out, which isn't exactly what you do, but you can pivot because you have an understanding of a method or access to a population. And I think that the panic of chasing the money kind of does create, that's kind of how I see that fragmentation leading to disengagement. I think it's I struggle with it myself. I mean, one of the reasons I was attracted to ethics is because it does allow me to dabble in a lot of different things, but it is harder, the right, like balancing the sort of deep versus the shallow in terms of learning everything that's going on in your field and getting involved in those deep discussions when you're fragmented.
So
I don't know if that
thanks.
was a good response.
No, that's good. I mean, it takes passion and persistence and perseverance to overcome some of these barriers.
Yeah.
And follow our heart and our mind. So before I turn it over to Stephanie to kind of close it out, we want to thank everyone, all of our attendees. We especially want to thank you for your time and effort and your willingness to share your thoughts with us today. If you could close with a challenge to our community, what would it be? What would that challenge be?
I mean, I think a challenge would be next time you identify a decision and you want to make it quickly, take the time to pause and talk to a colleague about it. That's been something that I have tried to implement in my own work, and it has become more of a habit. And so that would be my challenge, is to try to start to implement that pause and discussion. And I think the more people start to do it, the more comfortable other people will be coming to you to have those discussions. So that would be my challenge.
Wonderful. Well, if we were all in the room, we would be giving you a group applause.
Thanks.
We're virtual right now. So thank you once again. It's been wonderful.